Yeah, I almost went with emergency message for the channel because it's that important, but I just thought that sounded a little clickbaity, the kind of thing where you see that and you go there and the host of the channel goes, yeah, I've just posted a very, very important video over on my Patreon channel where you got to pay per view if you want to watch this nonsense. No, I'm going to bring it to you for free, freely given, freely received, freely given. Yeah, that's how it works. Now, a couple of things before we start. Unimportantly, if it looks like I was in a bar fight, I wasn't. I was in the dermatologist's office, and he froze something off here and froze something over here and snipped some skin off over here. And you know why? Because I grew up in the hot Texas sun playing baseball and golf, and I didn't wear sunscreen. You know why I didn't wear sunscreen? Because my sister routinely used it all up when she went out to play tennis. So she selfishly protected herself and left me to the dangers of the sun. And now that chicken has come home to roost. And I got to go back today. It's nothing, it's just routine. But well, fortunately, my next video, I'm not even going to be on camera. I'm doing something a little different. But anyway, so that really wasn't very urgent. That was the message. No, that's not the message. That's not the message. The other thing before we get to the message is Tom Horn passed away. I don't know if you saw that. I love Tom Horn. When I became a Christian in December of 2007, after living such a despicable lifestyle, that it's hard to believe. It's still hard for me to believe today that I'm forgiven. I believe it. It's just hard to believe. But his blood is that precious that it even forgave me. I'm embarrassed by that lifestyle. I don't even know who that person was back then. But when I became a Christian in 2007, Tom Horn, I started reading Tom Horn. Now, he didn't break down necessarily so much prophecy verses and do all of that. He just kind of showed and unveiled the supernaturalness of stuff, that we serve a supernatural God and our enemy is supernatural. And he wasn't always right, but boy, he was always interesting, and his heart was always in the right place. And he founded Skywatch TV, and he left 3 incredibly talented, bright children and a wonderful wife. And so our prayers are with him. I just wish Skywatch TV that he founded would embrace the truth of the Olivet Discourse, because they would be such huge champions in bringing that truth to a truth-starved church when it comes to eschatology. I don't know who's worse on eschatology. Hallmark TV channel, whose eschatology is when you die, you go to heaven to become an angel, and then you come back to earth and you try to earn your wings by bringing a couple together. Now, if you also fall in love with one of those people, you get to stay on earth and live again. Okay, I don't know if that rancid theology there is worse than what the church teaches in terms of eschatology, but it's close. All right, let's get to the message. Now, I want you to follow along because this is going to be important. It has huge implications if it's true, and I think it very well could be true. And it was sent to me by a viewer, James Englehart, sent me this. Very nice guy. Sent me and said, Stan, take a look at this. And we're going to take a look at a couple of verses in the Old Testament, because we're going to be dealing with a sentence from this verse, the one about the sea and the waves roaring. As you know, there are 3 signs that he gives leading up to war in heaven. There will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, on earth, distress of nation, the sea and the waves roaring, and then eventually people fainting with fear and foreboding as they see what is coming on the earth. Then they will see the Son of Man coming with power and great glory, and he will send his angels out to gather his elect. What an important moment in all of history. And so those signs are very important. Now, I did not know, as you know, that war in heaven was associated with his coming until about November of last year. At the start of this year, I knew I was compelled for some reason to go to the Olivet Discourse. And in so doing, I saw what he wanted me to see. This line right here, for the powers of the heavens will be shaken. And I realized that's what we just learned in the book of Revelation. It's war in heaven. What an amazing thing to know that it's coming. And there are signs beforehand, and we want to get these signs correct. And when I looked at the signs that are only available in Luke's version of the Olivet Discourse, this verse about the sea and the waves roaring puzzled me because I couldn't tell immediately if it was a figurative verse, because sometimes the sea is seen as the Gentile nations, but sometimes it's literal. So was this, in other words, the nations are distressed. Are they distressed because of the sea and the waves roaring? Or does it go like this? The nations are distressed and perplexed, comma, the sea and the waves roaring, a figurative emphasis, a restating of what he just said in a more figurative way. We do it ourselves. A guy could say, well, I went to town today to try and get the bank to give me an extension on the loan, comma, a fool's errand. So he's restating it with a figure of speech, an idiom. So that's what I was concerned about. And let me show you there's a dilemma here, folks, and I want you to see it. So please excuse the buildup, but you need to see this to understand it so that you can do what you will with what I'm about to show you. That verse that we're talking about is stated this way in the New King James Version. And on the earth distress of nations with perplexity, comma, the sea and the waves roaring. So you can see by that translation, it looks kind of figurative, doesn't it? Nations are upset. The sea and the waves are roaring, okay? Here's how that verse is translated in the English Standard Version. And on the earth, distress of nations in perplexity because of the roaring of the sea and the waves. There, it seems to be making this is causing the distress of nation. Why are they distressed and perplexed? Because the sea and the waves are roaring, okay? After James sent me the two verses we're going to look at, I went back and looked at all English translations. And I can see the dilemma that translators have with this. It's a difficult verse to translate properly, I think. A little more than half of our translations in English. I mean, I went through about, 50 translations. About a little more than half, maybe around 60%, use because of the sea and the waves roaring. A causality that's causing the distress of nations. About 40% leave because out. Their distress of the nations with perplexity, comma, the sea and the waves roaring, giving it a more figurative approach. Here's the problem, okay? First of all, obviously, who's right? Second thing is, there is no because in that verse. Now, the English Standard Version does a real good job of being very responsive to the Greek. Even though because isn't in there, here's what they would say, it's implied. But they believe by the way that verse was written, it's implied. But I want you to hear the Greek verse in Greek, in the Greek interlinear. Okay, this is what they're translating. So take a look. And upon the earth, distress of nations with perplexity, the roaring of the sea and rolling surge. Now, if you were a Greek expert, the decision you'd have to make is are the sea and the waves roaring? That surge means waves. It's only used here, this one verse, that particular Greek word. Is it laying out a more figurative situation or a more literal situation? It's tough to see. It's tough. It is. But there's possibly more going on here than even that. What the Lord may have been doing, thank you, James, for pointing this out, and maybe other people did as well. I just didn't happen to read your comment. But thank you for anybody who sent those verses to me to take a look at, because there may be something else going on. The Lord may be saying this, and upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity, comma, and then he alludes to two verses in Isaiah so that we will understand a little better what he's saying. Let's go to those two verses. We're going to Isaiah 17, verses 12 and 13. Listen to this. Now, God is pronouncing a judgment through Isaiah. Ah, the thunder of many peoples. They thunder like the thundering of the sea. Ah, the roar of nations. They roar like the roaring of mighty waters. The nations roar like the roaring of many waters, but he will rebuke them, and they will flee far away. Wow. That makes it sound as though the Lord was using this allusion, these verses, in the Olivet Discourse to describe the distress of nations as many nations roaring like the roaring of the sea. That comes across in these two verses rather dramatically, wouldn't you say? And this is not the first time that he alludes to Old Testament verses in the Olivet Discourse. At least one other time that I could find off the top of my head about the sun not giving its light and the moon turned to darkness. That's obviously from Joel, right before the day of the Lord. So it wouldn't be surprising if the Lord was referring us to Isaiah and these verses so that we would understand. It may not be a literal roaring of the sea and the waves like I had thought because of the translation in the English Standard Version that I was reading. It may be a figurative moment, and that changes things. Why does that change things? It changes things because we may be in that moment. Number one, if we're waiting for a literal representation of the seas and the oceans beginning to churn up, then it hasn't happened. But if it's the nations being upset and perplexed, as they are right now, and that was added to a week or two ago with the situation in the Middle East, and it may get worse. The nations are riled up, and they're perplexed. What are they perplexed about? Well, I'll tell you what I'm perplexed about. I want to know why everybody's lying. Okay, I'm perplexed at what's going on in the world, and I can't figure it out. They tell me there's a war in Ukraine, yet I don't see any footage. I don't see what's going on. I know one of the most powerful armies on the planet is attacking Ukraine, and yet people are flying into the capital of Ukraine and meeting with Zelensky. He apparently, when you meet with Zelensky in whatever building he's in, that's the safest building on the planet. I'm perplexed by that. I don't understand anything that's going on. And this is resounding all over the planet. So if that's what we're looking for here, one could argue that we are there. There's something else that this affects. Initially, I thought all three signs were generated by war in heaven. Possibly now, and re-looking at it, thank you again, James, only the third sign may be generated by war in heaven when people begin fainting and passing out as they see the ones, the angels, being cast to earth, and it's freaking them out. The other two signs, there will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, and on earth, the distress of nations, with perplexity, the roaring of the sea and the waves, aren't necessarily signs that war in heaven is happening. They are more signs that it will soon begin, much like the Bethlehem star. Jesus' birth didn't generate that star, whatever the Magi saw. The star was given to tell them the king was born. Jesus' birth didn't form those stars. God placed that sign so that the Magi would know the king is born. That would be the way these initial signs, the stars and the distress of nations, would be. They're telling us that war in heaven is now imminent. In that case, we could look at signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars and say, that's the Revelation 12 sign. And now we are seeing the distress of nations with perplexity. The sea and the waves are roaring, and the sea and the waves are roaring. If the mainstream news media were to provide us with what's really going on country by country, you would see there is cataclysmic upheaval around the world. People are not happy. The governments are lying to us. The news lying to us. We don't trust anyone. It's the strangest time I've ever been alive in. So if we look at this verse figuratively, it tells us we may be closer than we think. We can't guarantee that, of course, but we may be closer than we think because we've already maybe have seen the signs he was talking about in the sun, the moon, and the stars. The Revelation 12 sign was exactly that, a sign consisting of the sun, the moon, and the stars. And now all of a sudden, and it's liable to get much worse, there are other things coming that are boiling to the surface that may add to the distress and the perplexity of the nations. But we are reaching that moment, and it's an amazing thing. So what I'm going to do is, I'm not taking a literal view of this off the table. I'm adding onto the table a potential figurative understanding of these verses, and watch for both. Now, there is one other thing you can do with these verses. If you think they may be what the Lord is referring to in that verse of the Olivet Discourse, you could take a very bold other step and say that those verses come from the chapter that is specifically about the destruction of Damascus. That chapter begins with, "Behold, Damascus will cease to be a city and will become a heap of ruins." And it ends with, "At evening time, behold, terror. Before morning, they are no more." Now, if you say that that's what he's referring to, that's going way out there. You could be right, but it's bolder than I'm willing to go right now. I don't think these verses have to have the destruction of Damascus to be fulfilled. But the fact of the matter is, these verses do come from that chapter. Now, having said all that, there may be another verse that you want to bring up at this time saying, "Hey, Stan, what about this? You're talking about worldwide distress, and yet it says it will be like it was in the days of Noah when people were eating and drinking and marrying and giving into marriage. How does that fit?" So that looks like, when you first look at it, he's saying everything was fine one moment, then it was terrible the next. Whereas I would be saying the world is going to be in turmoil. And that doesn't look like the times of the days of Noah. I have always believed that we didn't understand what the Lord was saying there. He is not saying that in the days of Noah, everything was fine and then the flood came. That's not what he is saying. Let me show you what God said about the days of Noah right before the flood. This is what God said. "And God said to Noah, I have determined to make an end of all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through them. Behold, I will destroy them with the earth." So it was filled with violence in the days of Noah. We knew that. And perversity. It was bizarre. It wasn't bucolic. It wasn't like some pastoral painting. It was a mess. But what the Lord is talking about here is, in relation to what God is about to do, the earth was clueless. They didn't consider his will. They didn't consider his wrath. They just went about their business. And they're doing the same thing now. This is what Paul meant when he said peace and safety and then sudden destruction. He's not talking about there's going to be peace and safety on earth. We're in the tribulation, folks. We've been in it since the first century, according to the Lord. There's not going to be peace and safety, but what he's saying is the world is clueless that a day of the Lord is coming. They're just lottie-dying it. They're zippity-doo-dawing it. They're just whistling past the graveyard. And danger is coming. They're going about their business with not one care what God thinks or is planning. The days of Noah were filled with violence and depravity. And that's what we see on the earth today. And we also see that cluelessness. That's the key to understanding this verse, cluelessness of the world. I think we need to really consider what James showed us in those two verses. Not the Apostle James, James Englehart. Yeah. Thank you again, James. That's brilliant stuff. And I told him it was brilliant stuff. And I think we have to consider it. And I think I owe my friend Pastor Rich an apology because early on I asked him to take a look at that verse. I wanted another set of eyes on it. He thinks different than I do. I said, what do you think? He came back and said, I think it's figurative. And I blew it off and I went literal. And now I'm putting figurative back on the table. I think we need to consider that and consider that carefully. I'll leave you with this. It's a lot to think about. And we need to talk about this. This is what the church should be doing. The church isn't doing this. So we've got to do this on our own. We got to try and figure this out on our own. I could use the thousands of theologians out there who would be so useful right now. You wouldn't need me. And you wouldn't need Brad over at rev12daily.blogspot.com, who contacted me a couple of weeks ago. He said, I think you should read one of my all-time favorite books. It was written by a pastor, nobody's heard of him, in Boise, Idaho, back around 1980. It's called Angels on Assignment. I said, oh, okay, if you think it's a good book, yeah, I think you should read it. Well, I know why he wanted me to read it. That pastor had an angel encounter. Many people do. I don't know of anyone who has. And yet every time an angel encounter comes out on a YouTube, have you read the comments on it? Thousands of people leave comments describing their encounter with an angel. It's one of those things that seems rare, but everybody else is getting an encounter with an angel. I want an encounter with an angel. Do you want an encounter with an angel? I don't know. Maybe I should be careful what I wish for. Huh? Maybe we've had and just didn't know it. But he had a direct encounter, to say the least, with angels, with a couple of angels. And one of them told him, and I know this is what Brad over at Rev12 Daily, by the way, rev12daily.blogspot.com is keeping the Revelation 12 sign alive because the churches won't. So thank you, Brad. In that conversation he had with that angel, the angel said, we are looking forward, we don't know when it's going to be, to war in heaven. And you should tell your people to encourage them. And I had never thought of war in heaven as an encouragement, but it is. God is purging evil, and he's starting in heaven. And he will start that as soon as the church age ends. Throw Satan out, receive the bride, so that we don't have to stand in the throne room and hear the accusations from the evil one. They are cast to earth in the final bizarre phase. The tribulation will continue in a very bizarre fashion down on earth. And in that book, that pastor at the very last chapter said, the Lord is coming. He didn't know when, but the Lord is coming. And then he quoted these verses. There will be signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, and on earth. That pastor got it. What I'm trying to tell you is he keeps truth alive. That truth was being preached 40 years ago by that guy. He knew it. The church today doesn't know it, but war in heaven is coming, and it's such a big deal. He's given us signs so that we will know that it's either happening or it's about to happen. It's that big. We're trying to get the signs right, so we put all options on the table that are valid. I think a figurative view of the distress of nations verse is valid on the table. I think a literal view is still valid on the table. Let's see what plays out. We, my friends, brothers and sisters, are in special times.